The small city of Carl Junction, Missouri started to see a sharp increase in animal mutilations in the late 1980s. That was a time period that was still firmly in the turmoil of what the media would later call the satanic panic, but at the tail end enough to where law enforcement was becoming wise to the fact that media coverage could often do more harm than good. Teenagers dabbling in the occult had been a widespread problem for over a decade at that point, so police responding to calls about satanic graffiti or murdered pets were left with two options. Either they told the media and risked a panic, or they quietly took the report and tried to investigate everything as a one-off issue. The police in and around Carl Junction and the nearby Joplin area were trying to shy away from the panicked assumptions that so many others were falling into about cult rumors and greater conspiracies. So when dogs went missing and houses were vandalized, they tried their best to always tell the media they had no reason to suspect anything was connected unless they knew for a fact it was. Satanism was exceedingly popular among rebellious youth at the time, so much so that libraries couldn't keep books about Satanism on the shelves. The second someone checked a book back in, it was out the door again. Things really only seemed to get worse whenever the local police or church officials around Joplin tried to talk about the Satanism problem. In late 1986, some church officials said they were, quote, declaring war on Satan. In response, someone broke into a Joplin church and built their own satanic altar next to the real one. Police quickly realized that bringing attention to the vandalism was just giving the vandals what they wanted. Police were keeping an eye on things, but thought that for the most part the satanic graffiti and dead animals were just random acts by different youths here and there. And while that was true for much of the country, Carl Junction was an exception. What police didn't realize was that one teenage boy was in fact orchestrating the bulk of the animal mutilations in and around their city. This is Monsters. James Hardy went by Jim to his friends, of which he had many. People found him likable and charismatic. They wanted to be around him and hang out with him, even though his hobbies included reading about the occult and killing stray dogs in the abandoned mines around town. Jim had moved to Carl Junction with his family when he was in 8th grade. By then, he'd already started smoking weed, dabbling in hard drugs, and killing animals. He later said, quote, I was fascinated by death. I always had this obsession with killing things. I don't know really what it was. Like when I started out as a little kid, I couldn't just shoot a bird and watch it die. I had to tear it up. I just thought it was neat. He only refined his talents in his new home. His parents tried briefly to get him into counseling, but it didn't seem to be doing much good, so they stopped. But they likely didn't know the extent of what his disturbing hobbies entailed. As he entered high school, his grades slipped and he stopped being an honor student, but he stayed relatively average, book smart enough to get by with minimal effort. He was good with people too and made friends quickly. The friend he bonded with the quickest was a boy named Ronald Clements. Ron came from a troubled home and was delighted to have a new friend. His parents had a tumultuous relationship and would fight often. When his father left off and on, the family's strained financial situation only grew more dire. Jim gave him stability. Ron was somewhat aimless in life and hadn't really found his place, which wasn't at all usual for boys his age. Like Jim, he'd started drinking and experimenting with drugs, but a few years later than Jim had. He was also book smart, but lacked the easy camaraderie that Jim had with people. He was more reserved and spent a lot of time alone reading or daydreaming. When he hung out with friends, it was either to drink, smoke, or play Dungeons and Dragons. Jim and Ron had both also been dabbling in the occult before they had met, and their mutual interest inspired each other. They went to the library together to learn more, and would try to learn spells and draw pentagrams to summon the devil. According to Jim at least, their efforts may have worked. Jim later said he started to feel a presence in his mind, that he became convinced it was the devil corrupting him. Jim said, quote, "I would kind of just pray to God and Satan at the same time to see who is more powerful, and little by little, I fell out of God and started falling into Satan." Ron dove headfirst into Satanism as well. He painted his room black, hung up heavy metal music posters, and decorated his ceiling with a stuffed wolf's head. He bought a copy of the Satanic Bible that he hid from his family. Ron later said that he often had trouble distinguishing fantasy from reality, and he would lie on his bed upside down and hold out his arms, making his body into the shape of an upside-down cross. He would then pray to Satan to give him magical powers. Ron thought that when Satan finally decided to grant him the powers he was praying for, he would be able to hurt or even kill people with his mind. Jim was trying to get closer to the devil too. At lunch, he would enthrall his friends and any other curious kids with sermons on Satan or descriptions of the animals he'd caught and tortured to death. Jim started refining his torture techniques as he started to feel the devil's presence more. He began to make a game of it and see how long he could keep something alive before he killed it. We know considerably less about Jim Hardy's childhood than the other boys who would eventually be involved in the tragic events that would unfold, so maybe his parents noticed something was wrong, maybe they didn't. But Ron's mother Diana had noticed what was going on and was extremely worried about her son. Ron was worried about himself too. He started to wonder if they were taking things too far. He recalled trying to fall asleep one night and suddenly feeling as if his thoughts were not his own. He said, quote, "I felt like there was something else inside my head." When he told Jim what had happened, Jim understood and told him he also felt like he'd been possessed, but that he didn't want it to stop. Ron started hearing mumbled voices too, and though he couldn't make out what they were saying, it scared him. In the spring of 1987, Diana started trying to get Ron help, and he agreed that he needed it. They went together to see about getting him admitted into the Ozark Mental Health Center, which doubled as a drug rehabilitation facility as well. Ron was hoping they could help him get clean too. His mother didn't know about the worst of what he'd been getting into, but he'd been moody and irrational and had been getting into constant trouble at school. Ron spoke with an intake counselor both about his drug abuse and his violent thoughts. He even told him that he thought the devil was possessing him, but the counselor brushed him off because he didn't think that Ron would take getting sober seriously, and he didn't think violent fantasies were unusual for teenage boys. Ron didn't want to go back to the devil. He was worried he'd get possessed again, so instead he found a new idol when he watched the movie A Clockwork Orange. He loved it and he read the book soon after. The story follows the exploits of 4 young men in England who commit a variety of sexually and physically depraved acts. Eventually, the protagonist, Alex, is put in jail for murder and experimented on to rehabilitate him virtually overnight. They release him back into society to see how the rehabilitation went, and the story follows his journey as the reader wonders if he's going to revert back to his old ways. Ron was obsessed with Alex and started signing his journals with the name Alex rather than his own. Ron even started walking around school speaking with an English accent. Needless to say, his new obsession did not have Diana any less concerned than his previous obsession with Satan. When Ron went to stay with his father in Arizona for the summer, she read through his journals and what she found horrified her. The journals were filled with physically and sexually violent fantasies. One of the excerpts read, quote, "What if I were to kill someone? Would I feel remorse?" She was so concerned she showed the journals to a friend in law enforcement, but the friend assured her that they thought it was just normal teenage behavior. She then tried to go to the Ozark Mental Health Facility again, but the intake counselors still didn't want to hear it. They told Diana there was nothing to worry about and even told her to stop snooping on her son. While Ron was away, Jim had grown closer to another friend of theirs interested in the occult, a boy named Pete Roland, who went by Pete. Pete was quiet and shy, and he'd had a troubled childhood just like Ron. Pete's parents went through a messy divorce among other problems, so he spent his formative years in the foster care system. In many crime shows and movies, even today, when writers need a tragic backstory for why a murderer or serial killer became the monster they did, they can just say they grew up in the foster care system. Abuse and neglect were and still are rampant, and Pete did not escape that during his stay. At one home, he had a problem with bedwetting because he was 5 years old, and his foster parents thought they could fix him by rubbing his face in his own urine when he wet the bed. He was mostly raised by his older sister, and though she tried her best as a kid raising a kid, there was only so much she could do. Eventually, the siblings ended up back home when their mother remarried, but Pete was never close with his mother or stepfather after the ordeal he'd been through. He didn't really have a father figure or any strong male role model, so even though Jim was his age, he was desperate for his approval. When Ron got back from Arizona, he started hearing voices again, and while they had been unintelligible before, he could now clearly hear them telling him to kill someone. All three boys now fed into each other's delusions and violent fantasies. The boys would occasionally team up and kill animals together, though Ron claims he did not enjoy killing animals the way the other boys did. Sometimes Pete would go out and kill animals on his own and bring the carcasses to Jim so he could bask in his approval. Then he'd leave them in the woods or abandoned mines and visit them for weeks afterwards to pray to Satan over his sacrifices. He too thought that the devil would give him powers. Jim would later say that he somewhat blamed himself for Pete's corruption, though he maintained that it was all due to something supernatural and evil possessing him. He said, quote, "It's like something inside me slipped out and grabbed on to Pete." The boys would later say they'd tortured and killed so many animals that they couldn't even remember them all. One that stood out to Jim was when they burned a small dog alive inside an old dryer in the woods. He said, quote, "It sounded just like a human screaming." Despite his disturbing hobbies and his loud talk of the devil, people generally still liked Jim. As the boys all entered their senior year, Jim had the idea to run for student body president. He thought it would be funny if a rebellious kid like him won, and he did, by a landslide victory. Jim, strangely enough, started taking his duties as class president seriously, and his grades got better. He stopped arguing with his parents as much and even started talking about college. He stopped showing up to school high, though after school he still experimented with a variety of drugs. Though he was functioning on the surface, Jim was only getting more involved in his imagined relationship with Satan. Jim was praying to Satan to give him more power and said he started to hear the devil's voice in his head more consistently. He told one girl that he liked to drink the blood of the animals he killed, and that it tasted sweet. She asked him what human blood tasted like, and he said, quote, "Haven't gotten to that yet." Jim soon started telling everyone he knew that he thought he wouldn't feel truly fulfilled until he killed someone, and friends and faculty alike brushed it off as typical teenage rebellion. He would later deny that he ever drank blood, but his friends remembered him bragging about it, whether or not it was true. Despite everything, the crowd around him at lunch would change but never lessened, no matter how graphic his stories and fantasies were. One of the students who had a great deal of admiration for Jim was a boy named Stephen Newberry. Like the other boys, he came from a broken home. His father had left when he was very young, but his mother Marlise took good care of him and his three siblings. He had a brother, David, and two sisters named Cindy and Christina. Steve was a bit older than Jim and his friends, who were all still 17. Steve had been held back twice, so even though he was still a senior, he was 19 years old. He had some learning difficulties and was overweight, so the other students would often make fun of him. Marlise said, quote, "He was so eager to be liked and so easy to take advantage of." Because he was a bit older, he had an after-school job that paid him reasonably well at a barbecue restaurant. Jim would sometimes show up on payday and talk Steve into going to his dealer's house, then out to dinner to treat him and his friends. Steve's whole paycheck would be gone before he even got home. Jim later admitted that Steve was so eager to be his friend that he would do anything he said. Steve came along often when the boys went to torture and kill animals, but he never went out on his own. Paradoxically, he still went to church as often as he could, apparently just dabbling in Satanism to appease his new friends. Sometimes when Marlise couldn't take him, he'd even ride his bike. Marlise did not approve of Steve's new friendship with the other boys. Steve had told his mother all about his friend's interest in Satanism and how they'd hypothetically discussed killing someone. Understandably, she'd asked her son to stay away from them. As senior year wore on, Jim started to get more serious about experiencing what it was like to kill another human being. Ron and Jim briefly considered killing a homeless man before settling on finding a target they knew they could get out of sight easily. They started refining their method of murder as well. They liked the idea of crucifixion, but it was too elaborate. They thought about incorporating flogging and other torture techniques, but they finally decided bludgeoning would be the easiest. Most of the time, Jim welcomed Satan's voice, but one night he became convinced that the devil was taking his soul. He wanted to get away. In one last act of vulnerability and regret, he climbed into bed with his parents and asked them to watch over him while he slept. But that remorse didn't last long, and he soon went back to the devil's arms. He had a murder to plan after all. The boys weren't shy about their plans. One night in the fall, they were all at a party together, and the boys brought up how much they wanted to sacrifice someone as casually as if they were discussing where to get dinner, or what to do over the weekend. A freshman girl suggested Steve as the perfect victim because the boys always complained he was annoying, but they told her they wanted to keep him around for his money and drugs. In October, Ron and Jim were going over their plans in psychology class, ironically enough, and Ron asked Jim if he was really serious about them killing someone. Jim said he was, and Ron said, quote, "Well, let's kill Steve." They decided Pete would be a worthy accomplice and planned the murder for Halloween night. What the teacher was doing during all of that is unclear. The boys told at least a few of their friends of the upcoming murder. Lance Owens, a close friend of Jim's, was an artist, and he was excited for the boys to take their devil worship to the next level. In mid-October, Lance made a drawing of Steve's slaughtered corpse being held up by a giant. Lance told Steve that the drawing wasn't of him, even though the mutilated corpse in the drawing was wearing the same shirt as him. The boys' plan was disrupted, though, when Marlise took her kids to visit their grandmother out of state over the Halloween weekend. They tried to get him to sneak out and get high with them a few weeks later, but he didn't show, and they rescheduled for Thanksgiving. Jim later said that he thought Steve had heard about their plans, but only half believed it. He thought someone had talked or that Steve had overheard them, which is why he was hesitant to hang out with them. Steve was an aspiring writer, and as things were escalating, his writing started to become more violent. He started writing stories that all featured him killing someone. Jim later said, quote, "I think he was trying to let us know that he knew we were going to kill him, and maybe that would stop us." On November 29, 1987, Pete, Steve, Lance, and Ron all met up at Jim's house. Jim had enticed Steve out of the house with the promise to include him in some animal torture. Steve would do anything for Jim and agreed to go. Jim told Steve that they were going to catch and kill stray dogs in the woods by an old chemical plant. They got high and walked out to Pete's car, where he had their weapons of choice for the night. There were 4 baseball bats, but only 5 of them. Jim could tell Steve was nervous, so he gave Steve one of the bats and carried a hatchet for himself so Steve wouldn't suspect anything. The boys had planned things out and thought Pete should be the first to strike because he was the biggest. Then the rest of the boys would know when to attack. They led Steve out to a special spot in the woods. Jim had found an old cistern behind the plant that he thought held a special significance. When he first discovered it, he found a deer carcass floating in it and thought it was a sign from Satan. Jim had nicknamed the cistern the Well of Hell. The boys were planning on killing Steve near the well so they could dump his body inside. They hung around the well for a while, but Pete couldn't do it, and since they didn't see any dogs to kill, they all went home. Steve felt inspired by the adventure and wrote a story that concluded with him standing over a well, having done something vague and terrible, while his reflection smiled back at him. The boys decided they'd been too high and vowed to try again the following weekend. Jim later said that every failure just made him more determined to take a human life. During the school week, Pete and Lance passed the time by breaking into an abandoned house and vandalizing it with satanic imagery. Pete scribbled various pentagrams and wrote 666, while Lance drew the devil. On Friday, the boys all got drunk and high at a party and decided on Sunday for the murder. They couldn't wait. On Saturday night, Jim and Pete watched the Texas Chainsaw Massacre together, and Ron wrote the Ultra-Violence stick on his baseball bat in preparation for the weapon claiming its first human sacrifice. Sunday, December 6th was the big day. Jim and Pete helped out with raking leaves at Pete's house when they found a surprise. A kitten wandered into Pete's yard, and Jim said it was a sign from Satan. Everything's a sign from Satan, apparently. He put it into a mesh bag and said it would be their bait. They went to Steve's house and invited him out to help kill the kitten. Jim was uncharacteristically nervous. He couldn't look Marlise in the eyes. Marlise was hesitant to let Steve leave. She said she didn't want him around the other boys. But after an argument, she relented because he was 19 and he could make his own decisions. He told her he wouldn't stay out too late and that they were just visiting a friend. During that excursion, there were still only 4 bats, but Lance was not there. Jim had planned to be the one to strike first, and they figured they'd be able to overpower Steve even if he was armed. On the drive to the woods, Jim told Steve that he was being too rough with the kitten when he was petting it. Why he cared about that with what followed next is unclear. Perhaps he simply thought it was funny. They hiked out to the Well of Hell, nailed the bag the kitten was into a tree, and took turns beating it to death. Then they dumped it in the well. Steve wanted more. He said he wished they had something else to kill, something bigger. To that, Ron said, quote, "What are we going to do now, Jim?" But Jim had lost his nerve and simply said he didn't know. Pete understood and suggested they all get high. But according to Jim, when he asked Steve for his pipe, he heard a voice in his head say, quote, "Do it now." Jim bashed Steve in the face, but Steve got up and started running. He asked them, quote, "Why me?" over and over as the boys chased him, and Ron said, quote, "Because it's fun, Steve. Don't feel bad, Steve. It might have been somebody else." That gave Steve pause, and he stopped running as if he thought the whole thing might be a joke. Then he tripped and the boys were on him. They didn't hesitate. Together they hit him over 70 times. One of the bats broke in half. When they were done, Jim told Steve that he was their sacrifice to Satan. As they dragged him to the well, he tried to dig his fingernails into the dirt, but that didn't stop them. Ron told him to shut up and kicked him in the face. They then tied a rock to his body and threw him into the murky water. A later autopsy would reveal that there was no water in his lungs, so he must have died as they were weighing his body down. The remaining boys all went back to Jim's house and rinsed off some of Steve's blood. They then made up their alibi, that they would say they'd parted ways with Steve at a convenience store. Then Ron and Pete went home and Jim sat down for dinner like it was any other night. The next day, Marlise woke up early and thought she heard Steve yelling for her outside, but when she went to look, she couldn't find him. Steve had stormed off before and spent the night at friends' houses, but he had never once failed to call Marlise and tell her where he was. When he didn't show up for school, she called the sheriff. Lance carpooled with Pete that morning and was delighted to hear all about the murder. He was later given immunity in exchange for his testimony, so even though he'd nearly been involved in the murder, he was exempt from any consequences. At school, Christina worried something was wrong when she couldn't find her brother. Then she overheard the boys laughing in the hallway about, quote, stabbing a fat person. She called her mother because she was scared they were talking about Steve. The boys were all brought into the principal's office, but they had all memorized their alibi. Marlise had a feeling they were too late and even went so far as to start calling her family members and telling them that her boy was dead. After school, the boys got together to try and hide the evidence better. They haphazardly dumped bleach in the woods over the bloody areas. They looked to see if Steve's body was visible in the well, and they realized his jacket had floated up, so they fished it out and sunk it with a rock. Police tried to get the boys all to come in for questioning later that night. Jim left after simply bragging about how rich and politically connected his family was and told the police he had a great lawyer. Pete didn't show up at all, but when they brought in Ron, he confessed almost immediately. He was inconsolable, but whether that was from guilt or he was simply upset about going to jail is unclear. They gave Marlise the news later that night, and she told them she'd already been prepared for the worst. Ron took the police to the well late that night. They drained it and pulled out Steve's body around 1 a.m. on the morning of December 8th. They also recovered the kitten and 2 squirrels. They got Pete the next day hanging out at an empty construction site. He knew what was going on and immediately asked the police if they'd found Steve. Jim skipped school when he heard the police were looking for him, but strangely enough turned himself in a few hours later. The media made its way to the city, but the quick arrest and matter-of-fact statements from the police kept it from becoming nearly as much of a sensation as the other murders of the Satanic Panic era. Even so, articles on the case ran alongside experts dissecting metal music lyrics for messages from Satan or complaining about the violence on album covers corrupting the youth. Police were tight-lipped but quick to dispel cult rumors. Jasper County Chief Deputy Sheriff Larry Perrell told the press that they had absolutely no evidence that the killing was linked to a cult, and discouraged speculation as they knew everyone involved all deserved a fair trial. But later in the interview, police admitted they had found some evidence of possible cult activity, with all the satanic graffiti and animal mutilations, but that it wasn't necessarily connected. In other Associated Press articles, the story was twisted to say that there was a potentially powerful cult on the loose that had already claimed one life. Police corrected the media in later interviews and tried to keep a rational, objective viewpoint, and media hysteria died down a bit. That curbed the media frenzy enough that Steve's funeral was held in relative peace on December 10th. Students were only granted passes to attend after they were individually approved, to ensure kids who hadn't been his friends didn't show up to try and disrupt the services. There were around 400 people at the funeral, 3/4 of the crowd being other students. Steve had always worried he didn't have any real friends. Marlise said she hoped he was looking down and seeing how many people came out to remember him. She told the media that she missed her son terribly, but was happy that he was with the Lord. The trials were all held in relatively quick succession the following year. Jim Hardy took a deal. He pleaded guilty in exchange for life in prison without parole, so the prosecution could not pursue the death penalty. Ron and Pete, however, decided to fight. Jasper County Prosecutor David Dawley said he was going to pursue the death penalty for both the other boys. Local police attempting to keep hysteria from taking over managed to keep the story from getting too wrapped up in any kind of conspiracies. But updates on the trial did occasionally run alongside very strange reports. One included interviews with so-called experts who talked about Satanists having babies solely to kill them and sacrifice them to Satan. Ron went to trial first. He was evaluated as mentally competent, but was basing his defense on the argument that he had a mental defect or disease that rendered him not guilty. That defense was easier to prove than insanity, but also freed up the prosecution quite a bit as they didn't have to prove he was sane, and could focus their arguments elsewhere if they wanted. A psychiatric expert who'd evaluated Ron for the state testified that while he was anxious and had severe emotional problems, he could still tell right from wrong. So the defense brought in their own experts and witnesses. They tried to argue that due to his troubled childhood, Ron was virtually without a moral compass. They brought in his family to testify. That was when much of the information about his troubled childhood came to light. Charles Clements took the stand and admitted to being a terrible father and said that during the early years of Ron's life, he cared far more about drugs and alcohol than his family. He admitted to beating his wife in front of their son as well. Diana also admitted to using drugs while she was pregnant with him, and habitually using drugs in front of him as he was growing up. The defense was essentially an emotional appeal, but it didn't work. Ron was found guilty on May 4th, but the jury didn't think the death penalty was appropriate. Ronald Clements was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Pete went to trial next. His defense attorney, Michael Lyons, took a more scattershot approach. He argued that Pete had a terrible upbringing that had made him mentally disturbed, but also tried to convince the jury that Pete had been influenced by a satanic cult. Pete's family took the stand just as Ron's had to admit their wrongdoings in an attempt to save his life. Penny Bart, his mother, didn't hold back. She'd had a tumultuous marriage before she divorced her husband a decade prior. The jury listened to what it was like to grow up with alcoholic parents, and they heard all about the abuse he'd suffered in the foster care system. They also heard about how Ron's father had beaten him and sexually abused his sister for the brief period he was in their lives. While that testimony was compelling, Lyons also spent a great deal of time trying to scare the jury into focusing on a supposed network of satanic cults that had influenced Pete, and those arguments were usually cut down by the judge. Pete himself took the stand and somewhat expressed remorse. He said he didn't sleep at all the night of the murder, but when asked on the stand about how he felt during the killing, he said simply, quote, "I didn't feel anything." Psychiatric expert Dr. William Logan testified for the defense. He said that Pete had such a poor concept of right and wrong that while he certainly knew murder was illegal, he might not have really understood it was wrong. He also testified that there was an entire group involved, which made it easier, almost as if they were in a mass hysteria together. The prosecution hinged their argument on the killing being Pete's decision, not the result of other mitigating factors, as sad as they might be. On June 18, 1988, Pete Roland was found guilty of first-degree murder. Though the prosecution was going for the death penalty, the jury once again requested life without the possibility of parole. Though his mother and stepfather cried at the sentencing, Pete showed no emotion. After the trial concluded, Marlise said that she had learned to compartmentalize during the day to get through the trials, but at night she had trouble sleeping. She would say, quote, "I can control my thoughts during the day, but at night, when the shadows creep in and I'm trying to sleep, that's when I can see them beating Stephen." Marlise told the press that she'd hoped that the killing would have been a wake-up call for the other kids dabbling in Satanism, and it's very possible it was. Local librarians had planned on an uptick in kids checking out satanic books, but no such spike happened. If anything, there was a decline. As the years wore on, Marlise learned to move on. In 1994, she was interviewed to talk about how she'd been doing and said that Stephen would have wanted them to remember the things about him that made them smile or laugh, so she tried to focus on that. She said time had helped her to heal and that she didn't spend her mental energy on hating his killers. Quote, "Hate is a lot like acid. It eats away at the receptacle which contains it." Both Ron and Pete tried to appeal their sentences in the 90s. Marlise attended the appeals for both men and said it was very difficult because if she were to become emotional in court, they would be able to declare a mistrial. She had to remain stoic the entire time, and she worried that people were going to think she didn't care about her son. Ron's appeal focused on a technical error that would have actually meant he was guilty of second-degree murder, while Pete's focused on reapplying the mental defect angle. Both lost. Jim Hardy started appealing to withdraw his initial guilty plea in the late 2000s, but was denied as well. In 2012, the Supreme Court declared it was unconstitutional to sentence anyone below 17 to life in prison without parole, and in 2016 the ruling was made retroactive. Jim Hardy, Ron Clements, and Pete Roland all began the process of appealing once again. Marlise went to all of the men's parole hearings and didn't outright protest, but wanted to remind the board that at the heart of all of this, there was still a victim. She wanted to be Stephen's voice and make sure no one forgot about him. All three men sent her apology letters, and she said that Pete seemed the most genuinely remorseful. While they were incarcerated, all three men earned their high school equivalency. Jim and Ron spent a good deal of time doing charity work, and while Pete kept more to himself, he had a clean record. All three men won their appeals. Ronald Clements was the first to be released in February of 2021. Pete Roland was released in August of 2021. James Hardy was released a year later in August of 2022. All three men have avoided doing any kind of media interviews. All three seem ready to have a new start after spending over 3 decades behind bars. While there is a lot that was aired publicly about Ronald Clements and Pete Roland, most of what the media knows about Jim Hardy comes solely from a series of interviews he gave in 1988 when he was barely 18. Because he didn't try to fight his sentence, mitigating factors such as a poor home life or mental problems were never even considered in court, and were never brought to the public eye. If there were such factors that contributed to making Jim Hardy into the monster he was at such a young age, it's never been made public. At this point, all three men have spent nearly twice as long incarcerated as they've spent free. When the men were released, Marlise spoke with the media. She told them that she didn't ever want anyone to forget about her son, but she also had never wanted to take the path of revenge or hate. She made no mention of forgiving the men for what they did, but she said that if the court had decided they should be released, it wasn't up to anyone else to try and judge their decision. She said she hopes the men can make something of their lives and that she hopes they get a fair chance. She wanted to speak out and say that no one should harass them because, quote, "If I can show I can accept it, there's no reason for anybody else not to." If you're a fan of true crime, hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss an episode. You can also hit like or leave us a comment. You can check out our other show, Somewhere Sinister, on YouTube or anywhere that you listen to podcasts. If you'd like to support the show, check out our merchandise at thisismonsters.com. The link is in the description. Thanks again, and be safe.